Okay, we are going to look at Genesis chapter 22 again tonight. We're going to go back and look at just verses 1 through 8 quickly. I know we looked at them some last week and had some good thoughts on those, but let's so we can treat the whole story kind of in one night and kind of look at where we start out before we get to where we finish. Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 8.
22.
Genesis 22, 1 through 8. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took two of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about that. Again, we had some good thoughts last week about this interesting calling and everything, but talk about it kind of especially in the context of Jesus's statement in Luke chapter 14, verse 26, where if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And do you have any thoughts on that in the context of here of Abraham and Isaac?
Well, the only thought that comes to my mind, Abraham surely loved God more than he loved his son, his only son, at this point in time. And that's a hard concept for people, myself included, to understand, where you have a family, your wife and your children and your father and your mother, and God says, if you don't love me more than them, why you're not one of you, you're not mine. And that's an awful. I have no insight to it. It's just a hard concept to understand and to really to understand exactly how that is, because we're told to make sure that we take care of our family in our lives. So I don't know.
Supposed to honor your father and mother, and if you don't care for your children, you're worse than an infidel, right?
So, it sounds almost like a conflict. If you take it at those words only, do you understand what I'm
Yes, sir.
trying to say? And maybe we look at it wrong, or maybe not correct. Abraham certainly showed his faith in God in his trial. So I'm not sure I could do that. I really not.
It is hard.
Besides that, my kid's bigger than me.
Well, he takes after his dad then, not his mom, huh? He didn't get his height from his mom. It is a difficult teaching, and it's not maybe so difficult in and of itself as it is lined up against kind of our traditional focus of church being there to make families make the nuclear family as we describe it, as we define it, the ultimate end. We kind of struggle with that sometimes. Go ahead, PD.
Well, it doesn't make it any easier, but we are to put God first, period.
Yes.
And that's what this concept is saying. You put God first. Above everything else, God comes first. And that's where we run into problems, is that we don't always want to do that. It's hard to do a lot of times. When it's choosing between God and the church and your family, that's going to be a hard choice. But it's a choice that we're called to make. And it's not easy, and it's never going to be easy, and there's never an easy solution to it. But that's what we're called to do. That's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
Abraham is doing exactly this, and yet he does not hate Isaac. You know, God says, your only son whom you love. So,
well, that's why he's an example of faith, because we see in the story that Abraham had faith that somehow God was going to take care of this, and that Isaac would somehow be all right in some way, somehow. And so, you know, again, that's why he's an example of faith. And sometimes we got to work on ours.
the statement, the Lord will provide. And you don't know how, you have to trust. But kind of in the context of, I would say, at least mid-20th century and maybe through the rest of the 20th century and perhaps even now, in a lot of church contexts, the end is not so much being an obedient servant of God as it is having a happy husband, wife, 2.5 kids, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with 2 cars, and you know, and that modeling the dream Christian experience that's how we define Christianity. That's how you know you're being a good Christian, is because you have all of these things in your life in order. That if you're a good Christian, you'll be a good husband, and you'll be a good wife, and you'll be good children. And I'm not saying you won't, but the impact of it and how it is perceived by others may be such, even those closest to you. I mean, Jesus' family came for him, basically thought he'd gone crazy. So it's obeying God can be a very costly enterprise. And it can make even people who love you very much furious. And it can cost you lives, maybe not physically lives, but relationships. You know, there's just, I don't know what's going to happen with the election, and I don't know what's going to happen. You know, I don't know why we have to have the election so close to Thanksgiving, because if you're unhappy with the election, it's going to spill over for a lot of people into the Thanksgiving conversation.
Thank goodness for the pandemic this year. We're not having Thanksgiving, right?
Well, we'll see. We don't have some might say we don't have anything to be thankful for. We'll see how the election goes, and if you're thankful or not after that. But serving God can come at a very high price. And the thing is, God paid a higher price. And in a sense, you can look and say, God hated Jesus in a way, hated his son for us, because God sacrificed his son for us. And he didn't hate Jesus, just as Abraham doesn't hate Isaac. But the price that has to be paid is paid. And Abraham is paying that price, absolutely willing to pay the price. We've defined faith a lot of different ways, and it kind of is manifested differently, I guess, at different times. But there's this need to trust God, to wait on the Lord, to let him bring about the increase, as Paul describes it. I plant, Apollos waters, God provides the increase. There's this need, and it's absolutely a part of our belief system, that we are trusting in God. And on the other hand, we're called to obey, and sometimes we're not going to understand what that obedience is. So faith isn't sitting around waiting for God to solve all your problems. It's not sitting around waiting for God to fix the world, to change everything and make it all right. Faith requires obedience. But the obedience is not always, it's not just blind obedience. It's not just, well, this is what it says, so this is what I'm going to do. It is something that works on us, that challenges us, that exceeds our comprehension at times. But we go forward not blindly, but in faith, in trust. We know this is costly. We know this is going to hurt. We do it anyway, not because we just throw it up in the air, but because God has called us to do it. And, we don't sit around and wait God to fix it, and we don't just blindly follow him. We trust him. And we trust him with everything. And if we're not willing to trust him with it, then we will lose it. If we give up if you lose your life for my sake, you'll gain it. Whatever you give up for God, you can have. Even if you don't get your own family back, God can provide you a family. One of the best examples that I heard, I was at a lectureship one time, and the speaker had moved with his family to a different part of the country. And when he was growing up and teenage, and his whole life, I guess, his mother had cut his hair. He had never been to a barber shop, never been to a hair salon. His mother had always cut his hair. And he was telling the congregation about this. I guess I'll have to go to a barber shop the first time. I guess I'll have to go to somebody, a professional, to cut my hair. And after the services, one of the ladies said, why don't you come over to my house and I'll cut your hair? In a sense, he had lost his mother following God. And then God gives him, to a very limited extent and only one kind of manifestation. There's only one mom. You might find another dad. I don't know. You're only going to have one mom. But he kind of, if you lay down these things, I'll give you thousands of them. I will give you a multitude of mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And with all the problems that come along with it too, isn't it? It doesn't just, family. We see this is family right here, father and son. Family is not just the good stuff, is it? Family is not just dessert. Family is, I like them personally, but some people don't, Brussels sprouts, I guess you could say. Family is the things that are good for us that hurt. Sometimes they're not even particularly good for us. You have relationships with people who are family that you don't necessarily like because they're your family. And you invest in those relationships, and you'll take more guff off your family than you will anyone else because they're your family. So when people talk about the church being a family, it's not all good night, John Boy, good night, Grandpa. Good night, it's not all the sweetness of, I never even watched it, but the Waltons, I guess.
Well, they didn't always get along either.
Okay, well, then that's a good example because I never saw it. But there's this is an example of the hardness that you go through with family. And we can expect that in the church too, that when you come into it, it is a family, but families are all broken. Families are all dysfunctional at some level. And your church family is going to be dysfunctional at some level. They're not always going to be what you want them to be. You're not always going to be what they want you to be. And if you've never gotten your feelings hurt at church, you haven't been at church very much. So we see that. I think this is really a good example when you take that very difficult text of Jesus. And I don't think it makes it easier. I don't think this suddenly makes that text easier. But we see it in action. This is what Jesus is talking about. Trusting obedience regardless of what we perceive the consequences to be. We know the consequences. We know what's likely to happen. We trust through those consequences that God will provide. I guess the Lord will provide. Sherry is here saying good evening. So good evening to you, Sherry. So she had a hard day today, so glad she made it through it. Um, I like that quote by G.K. Chesterton. The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. So I don't think what we're doing is flawed or short of what, or we bring flaws into it. I don't think what God is calling us to do is flawed necessarily. It's just difficult. And yet we don't save ourselves by works either. So, but we do have to obey. Okay, moving on from those 8 verses, and again, we talked about them last week too. So, verse 9 through 14. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. And it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Okay. What do we think about that?
One of the things that jumped out at me when you were reading it, in verse 12, it says, Now I know that you fear God because you did not withhold your son. And that was, we're told to fear God. And that was an example of Abraham did what he probably found very distasteful. And yet he feared God. Just kind of jump down.
So something was learned. But God knows everything. This is what we've been pointing to, PD, all this time about God's all-knowing nature. We come here, and it's an interesting verse because in one sense, the angel of the Lord calls out, and Abraham says, Here I go, here I am. And then the voice, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know you fear God. That could be the angel talking, that I've learned that. But then the continuing part of the sentence, Since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham was not offering Isaac up to the angel, was he?
No.
It's kind of a trivial thing, but I always thought God stopped his hand. I thought that's what it said, that he stopped his hand.
It may be a New Testament passage. I know what you're talking about. It's not coming to mind where that's at.
I just tried to look it up, and I did a search, and I couldn't find it, but yeah.
But he like physically grabbed his hand, basically.
Something to that effect, yeah.
Yeah. That's
But it doesn't say that here. It just says that he called out to him. But anyway.
we chew over these stories some from time to time, and certainly ancient Israel chewed a lot on these stories and had a lot of writings, extra biblical writings, and oral traditions interpreting all these texts, and taking some fair liberties with them at times because they had their own image of God, And the passages of the Bible challenged some of those images from time to time. Each one of us, in a sense, has our own image of God. We don't fully comprehend God. We can't. So we see God from our very limited perspective, and we kind of make our minds comprehend what we can see and what we can understand a little bit. And then we talk to someone else, and they have perhaps a very different perception of God, a very different thought about God, at least a very different emphasis in their understanding of God. Because I have a wonderful Father, and because Jesus calls him Father over and over again, I think of God Father as a Father. That's my primary image of God. And it's easy for me because, again, I have a very favorable image of my own Father. Some people have a very dark image of their Father, very unfavorable image of their Father. And thinking of God as a Father, maybe it substitutes for the lacking relationship they have with their Father, but maybe the connotation is not helpful. So they may think of God in some other light. They may think of him as creator, and God is certainly creator too, isn't he? God is blessor. He blesses us. Most of the time, at least I struggle with thinking of God in terms of blessing, purely just blessing. You know, whenever we acquire something, a material possession comes into our life, don't we normally, at least I should speak for myself here, I think of how I acquired it according to what I did to get it. When you move into your new house, do you think, oh, thank God for giving us this house? Or do we think, look at how much we owe the bank for this house? You know. I like this new car. I had to go out and make a payment. I'm going to be making payments on this new car for several years or whatever. Do we say, thank God for this car? Yes, sir.
That was Nell. She's saying you're having technical difficulties.
Yeah, I'm on and off, I guess. It didn't want to go on at first, but we're just going to power through.
Okay.
It's nice that they can watch, but we're going to make this is the priority. So we like you, but we're still going to do our thing. So we're doing what we can. Thanks, Nell. Thanks for the update. Anyway, whatever our image of God is incomplete, but we get to, as we share our image of God with each other, we get a more complete image of God. Somebody emphasizes something about God that we don't normally emphasize, and we think, well, that's true, isn't it? And so gradually and slowly, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. So we become more aware of who God is and what he does for us, more hopefully appreciative, and that appreciation is reflected in our life and how we do everything that we do. But the idea, and I believe God knows everything. I'm not trying to say God doesn't know everything, but everything isn't, there's some things that aren't known yet. You're not predestined. Your whole life, every decision you make. I mean, this is a tough call. This is a tough choice. Mark I think, did it very good justice. This is hard. I mean, the idea, it's hard, I think, for everybody who's a parent. But if you think about their story, the story sets it up to be even harder, doesn't it? I mean, now he had Ishmael, but Ishmael's gone. They waited forever for Isaac to show up, and he shows up, and now he's having to kill him. So all that delays, all those setbacks, Abraham putting the covenant in risk with leaving Sarah to other men, and all these things built up to make Isaac so unlikely. But here he is. He's finally here, and now you got to kill him. And so that's the climax of this story, really. In a sense, the climax of the Abrahamic narrative. This is the big payoff. That Abraham, alone with what he wanted the most, which was an heir, wanted a son, and here he is. And now Abraham is ready to kill him. So shows up, the climax of the story, tension and everything, and then God intervenes and resolves all the problems. God moves in a way that resolves the challenges that Abraham is facing. The ram is not in the thicket accidentally. It didn't just happen to get there. Although animals can get themselves in some pretty difficult situations sometimes, can't they? You can find a couple of bucks dead sometimes out in the woods because they got their horns all tangled up fighting and they can't get loose. I've seen videos where old boy had to take a hacksaw and saw through an antler or two to get them unhooked and so they could run off. And so they get into it and they get themselves in a bind sometimes. So this is the idea of him getting his horns caught in the thicket, not completely out of the scope of possibility, but it's not there because it's possible. It's not there coincidentally or accidentally. It's there because God provided that ram. God put that ram there. They're not pointing out what was there all along. Go get that ram that I put there for you, that I provided. The Lord provided the ram. God provides the sacrifice because God only can provide the sacrifice. Only God can rescue Isaac. God rescues Isaac. Only God can rescue any of us. None of us can rescue ourselves. Only God can save us. And God saves us. So it's a very joyful, it's a very much a happy ending. That's not the complete ending of the story, but it's we're starting to move. Isaac, it's interesting, is not in a sense a major character in the story in the Genesis in and of itself. We kind of anticipate Isaac. Isaac's here, but as soon as Isaac is here, he gets married, and after a while, he got a couple of kids, and it becomes Jacob's narrative very quickly. So we don't have a lot of text focused specifically on Isaac. And one result of that is I think Isaac looks really good. We don't talk that much about him. They all look better. You know. Kind of a presidential campaign. The less you see of the candidates, the better they look, you know. Unfortunately, we're not going to see less of either one of them, I don't think. They're going to get a whole lot of both of them. But Isaac is, I think, presented the most noble of all three of them, really. But he has his fault problems, too. So it's God faithfully acting, God's graciousness, God's generosity. God saves the day. And yet God created this crisis, too, didn't he? So again, it's the story, comprehending, working to it, the lessons it's supposed to teach us. If we look at things like the evil of child sacrifice, and is anyone here not convinced that child sacrifice is evil? Do we need to talk about that? I mean, the evil of child sacrifice. God asked for child sacrifice. Abraham is going to commit child sacrifice. That is kind of, in a sense, a discussion for another day in another text. But it's that's not the point that's being driven home. But I mean, we're talking about it maybe in another time. Yes, sir, or ma'am. I didn't see who had their hand up.
I'm just going to say, going back to verse 12 for a minute. You're talking about the angel speaking to him. About halfway through verse 12, I know that you fear God since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Mine, me is capitalized, suggesting deity. This is God speaking to Abraham through an angel. But your son, your only son, and it repeats that as we go on. As you're talking about child sacrifice, as awful as this sounds, it's really not too much to ask, since it wouldn't, it probably, it wouldn't mean anything to Abraham at this point, but it teaches us something, doesn't it? When God was willing to offer his sacrifice of his own son for us.
And when we look back at the story of Lot, and again, for us, it's a very dim story, offering your two daughters up to a bunch of sexual deviants, but he's offering his children up for the salvation of others. That's one way of looking at it. It's a difficult way of looking at it, but it is, again, this American Christianity has become so much about family, and defining it as a nuclear family. They just didn't have that narrow of a concept of family back then. And when you love your neighbor as yourself, you're basically loving your neighbor as if he was a person in your family. That's what kind of the concept they're going for. They're treat him like he's family. And you do anything for your family, and sometimes you sacrifice one family member for another in a way. So, yeah, did I cut you off there? So, I mean, it's a hard story. It's hard. The teaching in Luke is hard. This isn't easy. And I've told you all this before. Anyone who says that the life of faith is a coward's life, checking out of difficult situations and just saying, well, God's going to take care of it, they don't know the life of faith. The life of faith is very difficult. It is more difficult to trust God and obey and do things that are counter to your nature than it is to just fix things yourself the best way you know how and to live according to your own wisdom. That's the easy way.
Yeah, it seems so, and then what do you end up with?
You get mocked and derided. You open your home up to two children from a different country who were impoverished or whatever, and they think you're some kind of slave owner now because you do that. You get questioned on everything. Nothing's good enough no matter what you do. You fail in your own walk of faith occasionally, and you're the biggest hypocrite that ever came. They call you that because they don't have any standards. They can do whatever they want. Whatever they do, they're not a hypocrite because they don't care. Yes, we're all hypocrites at times. We all apply to others standards we don't live up to ourselves. That happens sometimes. Every one of us has done it. We don't talk about it. But this is hard stuff. This is really,
But to follow up on that, they say a good leader is not going to ask you to do anything that they wouldn't do themselves, and that's I see Ray nodding over there. That's the point. God was willing to sacrifice his son. He wouldn't ask Abraham anything that God wasn't willing to do. Did you have more on that, Ray? Or?
Thank you for expounding on it.
So it's very much, Jesus is the ultimate expression of what almost every significant Old Testament character points toward. Jesus is, in a sense, like Abraham in acting in faith and leaving behind his home and going where God has called upon him to go. Jesus is like Isaac, born miraculously, a sacrifice offered up, and Jesus even more so. And that's true of almost every major biblical character. They foreshadow, they point towards Jesus, and Jesus just blows them all out of the water. He is exactly what God wanted humans to be. And no one else has ever been exactly what God wanted them to be. They're really close. Karen's really close, but, not exactly. We all kind of sin and fall short. So Jesus is Abraham, the ultimate expression of Abraham. He's the ultimate expression of Isaac, and Jacob, and Jacob. Well, he's a mess. We'll talk about him in the future. Okay. Verses 15 through 19. We've got a few minutes. We can get through the rest of this. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. And he said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So, again, a recitation of the basic Abrahamic covenant, but placed in the context of the sacrifice of Isaac. God has he's already promised all of these things to Isaac, but now it's re-promised to him in the context, which presupposes really that it was again hanging in the balance. If Abraham isn't willing to sacrifice Isaac, then again, what you are willing to lay down, God will take up again. You're committing it to God, and he will give it back to you. And if you withhold it from God, you lose it. So, but that's the covenant restated once again. Verses 20 through 24 are a very brief genealogy. Now it came about after these things that if it was told Abraham, saying, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Aran, and Chesed, and Hazo, and Pildash, and Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also bore Tebah, and Gaham, and Tahash, and Maacah. Okay, so you got to hear me pronounce poorly, probably some tricky Hebrew names there. This genealogy is brief, and the big star of it, of course, is a female this time, Rebecca. A little foreshadowing. We will be studying her, looking at her pretty soon. Just also in your handout, if you have it, there's some New Testament passages that are about God testing and providing. Again, we don't think of God as tempting, but we say he's testing. And with the test, he also provides. So Abraham was tested, and then God provides the answer to the test, the solution, the resolution of the test. So anybody have any closing thoughts?
I wonder what Isaac thought the next time his dad asked him to go for a walk.
Well, as long as he didn't have fire and a knife, maybe he got him to go, but it was... Even father and son relationships can be tested sometimes, especially those sometimes. Okay, Mr. Kelso, will you lead us in a closing prayer there?